Well, I know this is at least Steven's second trip to the Kauffman Foundation. The first one, he would probably tell you, was a little less than successful. It was at a time when Kauffman had a called Kauffman Campus Initiatives Grants Program, and Carnegie Mellon was in the running. And suffice it to say, Carnegie Mellon did not receive a grant, but I'm sure that Steven remembers his visit to Kauffman very well anyway. And Steven, welcome back to Kauffman at least a second time. Thank you.
I have traveled all over the world with him, where I was the spouse, and when he was attending a conference, I would go shopping, I would travel, I would be a tourist. But this year, the 20th anniversary of the CCC, I decided to actually stay and be present and be part of the conference. I gotta tell you, I'm so moved. I'm also going to have to show him a little bit more respect, because people are talking about my husband in a way that he doesn't quite get that kind of deference at home, with the wife, with the family, with the children. So I'm going to have to go back and relay that to the kids, Ariel and Julian, who wish their dad the best. And it's really touching. It's very moving. I'm very proud of him.
Peter Merman and I were part of this original 1994 CCC class, and so we've sort of coerced some of the folks who were with us on that frigid weekend in Pittsburgh, as well as some of the original faculty and other folks from Carnegie, to say a few words. So before we get started on that, I wanted to just give you the results of the winner of the CCC trivia quiz and the answers. I didn't get very many responses. 3 people got 3 of them right. So I don't want to give it to them. I'm going to give it to Alfonso, who only got 1 right, despite having been at the CCC quite a few times. So very briefly, how cold was it in Pittsburgh? Well, Steven gave us the answer to that, -20. What does CCC stand for? So some of you thought by actually looking at the program for this year you could cheat on that one, but they just copied the program from last year, which is actually wrong. It's not the Consortium for Cooperation and Competition, it's actually flipped. It's the Consortium on Competitiveness and Cooperation. Who has attended the CCC as a student 3 times? In the early days, we were desperate to get people to present. So believe it or not, all 3, Hank Chesbrough, Peter Merman, and Arvid Zadonis, have presented at 3 CCCs. Chris Tucci and Steven Klepper, along with Rod Shree, have both organized the CCC twice. Chris, when he did it in 1999, implemented the infamous egg timer, although I've been told that Brian Silverman also likes to do that, but I think Chris got there first. And then last but not least, the year that SARS kept many of us from going is the year that it was in Toronto. So a little bit of history. And now Peter has got a series of comments and videos that those who couldn't make it here wanted to contribute, and has just been amazing with editing and putting all of this together on a YouTube channel and making me feel really technically inadequate, which doesn't take much, but Peter.
Thanks, Mary. I don't know if I remember the Wizard of Oz correctly, but I think Dorothy lived in Kansas and then was swept into the land of Oz. I landed in Kansas from a real land of Oz, Australia, to be with you tonight at the 20th anniversary of the CCC and to celebrate Steve Klepper's contribution to the CCC. As Mary already said, there were a number of folks who just couldn't come to Kansas. But those folks clearly wanted to be here. And initially I thought my task was easy, well, we'll just collect videos. But there were so many people who wanted to speak tonight, and some of the people actually produced very long videos. So Rashmi and Mary then gave me a hard task. Said, Peter, can you please edit in that? And before I go to show you the videos, I should say that the long versions of the videos, as well as the photos which the CCC community has sent in, we only showed you a couple of them. There are wonderful photos from MIT events, from Lausanne events. And so what we talked about is actually having a website on the history of CCC, and we'll keep you posted, and you'll see the, you can all see the longer videos. And Steve, I'm sure you will enjoy the longer videos Now, before I show you this, I just want to say one thing about Steve. For me, being at the first CCC and coming back to CCC has really been amazing, and I reflected on what benefits that personally draw. And you will see many of the ex-CC people talk about this, but the one personal benefit that I've had is, one, I learned the word curmudgeon. Now, Steve Klepper referred to himself as a curmudgeon, and I actually didn't know what the word meant, being a foreigner. So I had to look it up. Now, Steve, I can tell you, if you're a curmudgeon, you're the kindest curmudgeon I've experienced, because Steve has given comments on most of the papers that I've written in the last 20 years. So I want to thank you for that, and now I'm going to show you some videos of other CCC alumni. The first video comes from David Maury.
Steve and honored assembled guests, it's great to see all of you, including this research conference that emerged out of what I recall, and I'm sure Steve will correct me on this, was a lunch on the Berkeley campus back probably in the fall of '92. And Steve was there, and Dick Nelson, and David Teese, and I think Tim Bresnahan and Dick Rosenblum as well. And we came up with this idea of an annual conference focused on students. So this research conference focused on mentoring is a relatively unusual model. It's one that I think both Steve and Dick Nelson were strong advocates of. And obviously in the ensuing many years since that long ago lunch, when all of us had more hair, I think Steve really has played a leadership role, obviously, in both sustaining and enabling its survival, financial as well as intellectual. In my view, this has been a very successful model. I think the fact that many of you gathered in Kansas City are alums, are now mentoring your own students. This is a real mark of success. We all should be enormously proud of it. Steve in particular should enjoy enormous credit for it. And I would just add in conclusion that, Steve, on behalf of literally dozens of Haas School PhD students and dozens more of students from all over the world, thanks so much for keeping the faith and sustaining this over these 20 years. Thanks a lot.
The person who invited me to the first CCC conference was actually Richard Nelson at Columbia, and as we heard, there were not so many students at the beginning. I went 3 times, and Dick couldn't be here today, but he wanted to send a little letter. So I'm reading to you the letter from Dick. David Teese should get the credit for the establishment of the CCC. But David, being David, it was left to David Maury and myself to get the ball really rolling. At the start of the CCC community, it was a fragile one. The occasion that really brought the community together was the bitter cold CCC gathering that was held in Pittsburgh in January 1994. An amazing, rewarding, unforgettable experience for those that were there, and the experience which durably bonded us. As I and later David gradually faded from the scene, Steve took over the leadership role. Thank you, Steve, for keeping the community together and growing. The next person who also couldn't be here, but didn't want to be, also wanted to address us, is Sid Winter.
Hi, Steve, and hello, everybody. I regret that I'm unable to join you for this great anniversary celebration, but I was committed to the SMS conference in Geneva before the CCC meeting time was announced. As Dave Maury reminds us in his own remarks, the Consortium on Competitiveness and Cooperation was originally a large research project funded by the Sloan Foundation, of which the Doctoral Colloquium was only a small part. And I joined up in this parade just in time to follow it into a very bitterly cold Pittsburgh in January of 1994. This was the legendary first meeting of the CCC Doctoral Colloquium, which was organized by Steve Klepper, and it was one of the first of Steve's many important contributions to the cause. Fortunately, there was so much positive energy in that meeting that everybody managed to avoid freezing to death, and Steve's reputation was only temporarily diminished by the fact that he'd been an abject failure in controlling the weather. So Steve, I want to join in the general gratitude to you personally for your leadership in the colloquium. And I think it's also important to mention that your leadership in the research domain was also very significant. You set not only were you an effective mentor, along with many of the rest of us, but you set a particularly fine role model and showed people that it was really possible to do deep and significant research on these topics. And the students who have attended the colloquium, as well as the rest of us, have benefited over the years from your insights and your empirical findings. So thanks once again, Steve.
Now, Mary had a slide today showing you where the first class of CCC people came from. If you ever applied to Harvard and didn't get in, you should feel really good, because none of the people from Harvard at its first CCC, I have seen them ever again. No publication, nothing. In fact, you know, if I were to pick the two institutions which were core CCC, it's MIT and Berkeley, and we have a number of Berkeley folks, MIT folks who want to talk to you. The first one is Rosemary Sidonis.
Hi everyone, I just wanted to share a few memories of the first CCC. First, as you may have heard, it was absolutely freezing. So Steve, you really introduced us to the cold winters of Pittsburgh. The second was that I was a second-year PhD student at the time, and I couldn't believe that Dick Nelson was actually going to be the person to comment on my work, as he being one of the co-authors of the Levin, the Yale survey. I just was pretty starstruck by that. And finally, I was incredibly relieved. As a BPP student at the time, I thought something was wrong with me for not studying transaction cost economics. And I met lots of kindred spirits interested in innovation that have remained cherished colleagues to this day. So Steve, we all owe you a great deal of thanks for all that you and others have done to build this wonderful community of colleagues. Thank you.
The next person we're going to listen to is Scott Stern, and I remember one thing about Scott on the first CCC. He only got to his third slide and had 15, because back then we were not nearly as sophisticated as today in terms of the timing. So this was Scott only doing a part of his CCC presentation, but now he's coming back.
Happy 20th anniversary to the CCC. I'm sorry that I was not able to join you this weekend. I would have enjoyed another great doctoral consortium, a celebration of a great 20 years, and another 20 years going forward, and as well a warm and I'm sure thoughtful roast of my friend, colleague, and mentor, Steve Klepper. Now I'm sure others will recollect those early years in Pittsburgh, and I'm sure Steve will recollect that how cold and snowy it was that first year in Pittsburgh. I remember the story, though, somewhat different. I was able to meet a group of vibrant young colleagues who showed me that there was an incredible field that was forming that was around topics that I was interested in. Mary Tripsis, Brian Silverman, Jackson Nickerson, Ellen Afua, Chris Tucci, Hank Shesbro, and others all became part of the invisible college for my generation. Equally importantly, I was able to meet, sometime for the first time, senior colleagues who provided valuable mentoring and advice, guidance and support over the course of my career, and as well to other colleagues and students going forward. Sid Winter, Dick Nelson, Rebecca Henderson, David Teese, all of them. But none more important from that meeting than Steve Klepper, who became the touchstone for forming and establishing this invisible college and this institution going forward. Today, CCC has established itself as an important and perhaps the most important meeting place for junior scholars in the economics and strategic management of innovation and entrepreneurship on an annual basis. Why was this institution so valuable? Well, as Steve's research would teach us, it was an early entrant and it was an able entrant. Essentially, Steve put together the conditions that allowed this institution to survive. Perhaps as another indicator of that is the amount of spawning and spin-offs that we see from the CCC over time. Whether or not it's initiatives of junior faculty and even now senior faculty getting together with their origins traced back to those first CCC meetings. Have a great weekend.
Now, I did edit that video a little bit. You can see.
Hi, Steven and everyone else. I'm really sorry I couldn't make it in person, but I'm really delighted to be participating in the celebration of the CCC's 20th anniversary via video. My first CCC was, which was in 2006, was not really as dramatic as the first gathering that many of the inaugural class have spoken about. But in some ways, it was equally momentous, as it was the first time that the CCC had convened outside of the US. Stephen, I hope you feel very proud of the scope of the influence you've had on so many generations of scholars, both in the US and across the world. And I want to say a personal thank you for being such a wonderful mentor to me over the years, and wish you a very happy 20th CCC. Thanks.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Tom Osterbro. I'm a professor of entrepreneurship and strategy at HEC in Paris. The day before my proposal defense, Wes calls to me and says, my daughter is sick. I can't be at your proposal. But no to worry, I'll be available on a speakerphone. Just before I'm about to begin, Steve shows up and sits down in the back of the room. I start my presentation and I get about 45 minutes into the presentation, at which point Steve clears his throat and says, I think you're doing this completely wrong. What's the moral of this story? Well, the first point is that only argue with Steve if you know that he is wrong. The second point of the story is Steve is almost never wrong. Let me summarize a bit Steve's legacy to me and maybe to some others. Arranging the first CCC was a great accomplishment by Steven and by all the others on the organizing committee. Most important was the sense of community that the CCC has created among this group of scholars. I met many to-be friends at the CCC and a couple of co-authors, and I learned a lot of exciting new work in little time by attending as a faculty follow-on. Another part of Steven's legacy has transcended into Europe. When arriving to HEC in 2008, I found a lack of market mechanisms for young scholars in the strategy, entrepreneurship, and innovation area. So together with Corey Phelps from HEC, Eamon Salter from Imperial, Kel Larson from CBS, Alfonso Gambardella from Bocconi, and Gary Jusnitsky from LBS, we created the SCI Doctoral Consortium. Steve, thank you first of all for helping me get my career started. You've been a tremendous help for me. Thank you also for CCC, and thank you for being such a good sport.
Okay, and now we have a live presentation by Will. Will, I should say, was also a faculty member at the first CCC in 1994, and I give you the microphone.
Thanks, Peter. So, I've got to say, you've heard that it was cold. And it was, the moment I walked in, it was one of the things that made me feel right at home, actually. I grew up in the interior of British Columbia, 20 below before global warming in the winter. It was kind of warm. So it was very nice to be there right from the beginning. But put this in context. This is 3 months, this is January 1994. This is 3 months before I filed my tenure packet. And I'm not quite sure who's going to be on the list of people that I'm going to ask them to, consider sending letters out to. And I knew that if they sent it to mainstream economists, I was dead. I knew that I sent it to mainstream organization theorists, I was dead. And I knew I'd be in great shape if they could send it to mainstream senior strategy scholars, but you could count them on the fingers of one hand after you chopped a few fingers off. The strategy field's changed a lot over the last 20 years. And Wes is one of the people I looked around the room and realized half the people that were going to be on the list were in that room. And I knew I was in the right place, intellectually and pragmatically. And over the last 20 years, I know I'm in the right place, both, and especially the pragmatics have largely gone away, but the intellectual part is very much there. And Steven, the other folks who have organized this over the years, this is amazing, really important, incredibly important for me. And I love seeing this many people in the room who believe that it either is or will be important for them. So thank you, and thank the rest of the folks who have been involved in this over the years.
Connie? Connie was also a faculty member at the first CCC.
So actually I wrote out my comments, but this, because I'm terrible at improvisation. But I am an improvise and tell you that I didn't actually make it to the first CCC. And this is what I learned what a good guy Steve is. Because I had to call him up the night before and tell him that my, 4-month-old daughter was really sick and I couldn't make it. And for the same reasons that Will was worried, I was worried. And Steve was incredibly gracious. So I had to wait to come to the next CCC. So let me say a few words about the CCC and Steve's role. So for me, the CCC calls to mind the line from the movie Field of Dreams. I love this line. If you build it, they will come. I think that's the CCC. And to echo what everyone else has said on the videos, this is due in large part to Steven, who was instrumental not only in starting it, the colloquium, but actually in keeping it going. It was really critical. And we all know how completely overcommitted and busy Steve is. And what's amazing is he always manages to make time for the CCC and the people in it. And I have to say for myself, that goes in spades. And specifically, I'm completely in Steven's debt for all the time and effort that you put in to help start the FIVE project. So one of the wonderful things about CCC is that doctoral students go on to become junior faculty and then senior faculty. And Steven has always been one of their most fervent boosters. So I can't tell you the number of times that Steven has said, so-and-so has a great paper and you really should read it, or you have to get to know so-and-so, and other forms of advice, which I imagine many of you have gotten a lot of this free advice. But the result is that we all know many more smart and interesting people than we would otherwise. So I remember when I was a lot younger, like a lot younger, my friends and I used to have these discussions about whether an individual really could change the world for the better in a significant way. I mean, this is when people were marching against the war and things like this. So to me, the odds seemed uncomfortably low, right? But that doesn't stop people from trying. And I think that we're all grateful to Steven, who has permanently changed the world for the better by spearheading the CCC. So thank you.
Okay, now we're going to hear from Wes Cohen. Wes was also a faculty member at the first CCC and was at many CCCs, but he, of course, was also a colleague of Steve so many years at Carnegie Mellon, and that is why he knows things that we don't know.
Steve, I'm happy to be participating via video in this celebration of the CCC. And as a part of our celebration, I wanted to take this occasion to mark particularly your founding of the CCC on, as we all remember, a frigid day in Pittsburgh 20 years ago, and especially to highlight your ongoing role as mentor-in-chief of generations of rising PhD students, many of whom now surround us as colleagues, as we see. You have always been on the front line with these students, offering them incisive questions and invariably helpful suggestions. In fact, Steve, some might say that you took this role to new heights, becoming a modern version of the Grand Inquisitor, but not like the inquisitors of Renaissance Italy, who tortured and persecuted Galileo for his heretical science. No, your intent has been quite the opposite. You encourage heresies as long as they're the fruit of the rigorous search for insight and empirical truth. So I'd like to take this moment to honor you, Steve, as the Grand Inquisitor and Scholar of the iconoclastic Church of the Study of Industrial Evolution and Innovation. I would also like to take the occasion to express my personal gratitude for your subjecting me to more than 30 years of comparable torture as a collaborator, colleague, and dear friend. Our conversations always make me better.
Okay, now Dan Leventhal.
Hi, Steve. So I'm at the Australian School of Business in beautiful sunny Sydney. So naturally my thoughts turn to those near Arctic conditions when you, much like Shackleford, led a brave expedition down Forbes Avenue. Steve, through your force of will and your Shackleford-like determination, you've created a really important institution. I think often as scholars we think about impact in terms of our individual papers, but I think some with vision, magnanimous heart, although in your case, of course, encrusted in a secure, curmudgeonly exterior, one thinks also about the institutional context in which people work. And you've created one of the really great success stories with hundreds of students benefiting. So I'd like to salute you and say more, but they just told me the surf's up at Bondi Beach, so I gotta go, but enjoy.
Okay. And we have Patrick Lerena couldn't come here in person, but he sent a letter, and Guido Bünstorff, who's also from Europe, is going to read the letter.
Okay. I know nothing about the weather back then in Pittsburgh, and I don't know why Peter decided that you should have a German accent instead of a French one. But I'm happy to be here, and I'm happy that I can read these lines, which I fully subscribe to. And this is what Patrick has written. Dear Steve and dear colleagues from the CCC conference, I'm not able to join once more the CCC conference this year. And I deeply regret, in particular, because I'm not able to celebrate with you the 20th anniversary of the CCC conference, and to thank you directly and personally all the organizers of the conference, with a special thought and thank to Steve. I would like to insist on the great importance for European PhD candidates, and not just PhD candidates, I would say, to have access to a window on the US research arena, to get discussions and feedbacks on their projects and research from high-level international experts, to interact with other PhD candidates and senior researchers from all over the US, from the most prestigious institutions. It has also been a great contribution to our PhD program ETIC, which stands for European Doctoral Program in Economics of Technological and Institutional Change. I would also like to insist on the importance of the CCC conference organized directly in Europe, EPFL, Copenhagen, and hopefully once in Strasbourg. It allows for a dense and interactive transatlantic community in fields like innovation management and innovation study, fields with a long, historic, and European tradition. Thanks to Steve and all the others, from Dick and Sid to the new generation, for allowing our community to develop and to invest in the most important dimension of our mission, the education and training of the next generations. With my best wishes to the 2013 edition and the next ones. Have a nice CCC conference. Patrick Lerena. Thank you.
Okay, and now we're going to move again to live speeches. David Hounshell, are you here? David Hounshell is also a colleague of Steve's.
Yes, and I've been a colleague of Steve's since August of 1991. As a matter of fact, we share a wall between our offices. We're in the same office suite. So most of you have been able to infer from the various comments about Steve's role in the CCC that he's a superb colleague and teacher. I just want to point out a few things that you might know about and might not know about Steve as a teacher. First of all, he is an award-winning teacher at Carnegie Mellon. He won an undergraduate teaching award. in the early 1990s is called the Ryan Teaching Award. One of the things that you've also inferred from discussion about Steve being a great critic of people is, in terms of their work, you should be around my office and Steve's office in the fall semester when he teaches his fundamentals of economic principles twice each semester. A couple days after he gives midterm exams, there's a hall full of undergraduates that are sitting down on the floor, standing around, looking very, very downtrodden. And little do they know, at least the first time, that they are being Klepperized. Now, what do I mean by Klepperization? Steve, upon learning that certain students don't pass the midterm exams, Steve calls the undergraduates in. And they calls them on his carpet, literally, and asks them to explain why they failed the exam. Now, just imagine if your undergraduate economics professor or any professor did that to you. And this goes on for hours, from 4 o'clock until like 7 o'clock, all week long after these exams. And Steve takes this very seriously, but I have a lot of fun with these undergraduate students because I tell them about Klepperization and how terrible it is to be Klepperized as a faculty member. So you get some sense of that. Okay. A couple other things that you may not know about Steve in terms of Carnegie Mellon, and that is that he actually is known around Carnegie Mellon as a curmudgeon. So that's important. He's also the creator of our PhD program, the Set Change program. He did all the heavy lifting for several years. Wes Cohen and I tried to create a program, and we could never win the president's and the provost's support because neither one of us was really willing to do what the president said was to lay your life down on the line to create this program. Steve stepped up to the plate, and we at Carnegie Mellon are all in his gratitude, not just the faculty and the graduate students, but 4 units in the university as well. So that's a very important thing. Another contribution that Steve made to Carnegie Mellon was that he chaired a committee on general education reforms just before I came to Carnegie Mellon, and those have had an enduring effect on undergraduate education at Carnegie Mellon, in which he really emphasized both the importance of scientific, technical, and business entrepreneurial education. So very important there, and that's carried over into his leadership on some of the entrepreneurial education at Carnegie Mellon. One couple final points. Yes.
Very little time.
Very quick. I didn't show a picture, but you might want to ask Steve about his fear of heights. I have lots of pictures of him grabbing next to the cliffs or avoiding those. Final things, we've heard about Pittsburgh weather. I did bring along hourly weather temperatures from Pittsburgh, and it was not as bad as the reputation.
Thank you, David. Okay, Peter Roberts.
Okay, first a confession. I'm not actually here for the CCC this year. I'm just here for Steve. I like everybody here. I absolutely adore you. So speaking of kind of our relationship. So I worked at Carnegie Mellon for 3 years, and some people think, oh, that's how you get to know someone like Steve. We never actually spoke. I think we spoke once, when I was there. So I actually inferred that Steve must be a very focused, man, because obviously it wasn't me. We actually met because we were both simultaneously being courted by Columbia University, and as someone who tried to court you to Emory and then find out that everybody else has been trying to court you along the way, I learned that you may flirt a fair bit with a bunch of other folks, and Florence might be very happy to know this, is that you basically marry once, right? So someone who's unbelievably focused, unbelievably committed, So I got a chance to start working on a project with you and many trips to Pittsburgh to work. Those things are kind of like, usually when I work with collaborators, we talk a little bit, we eat a little bit, we talk a little bit. Steve's like literally from the morning to I had to eventually enact, and I'm the younger guy, right, to enact a no more talking about the paper rule, which I think actually endeared me to Florence. You know, and the other thing is that we used to drink a fair bit of wine, and that was the time you stopped drinking wine. So the other thing that endeared me to Florence is we got drinking an awful lot of wine, you know, together. So I you know, dogged and determined and massively focused. So I look at, you know, this focused and committed and just all the attributes you kind of want to have in a project. And I, you know, as our collaboration kind of came to the end, I kind of thought there's either something massively special about this guy, right, or something kind of massively flawed, yeah, about me. And I think the answer for me is kind of like both, right? So you're awesome, and I'm, you know, you won't know this because I'm sad, right? We haven't been in touch a lot in the last little while, because I think I just working along, you know, on a project with you, I realized that you kind of got to really care, right, about the stuff that you're working on, and like care is like this is everything. And I tell my students, right, that there might be only one person in the field that you want to emulate if you want kind of a genuinely productive and intrinsically interesting academic career, and it's yours, right? And when I talk about students about kind of what makes for kind of good and interesting work, I refer to you all the time. And so although we haven't been in touch much lately, and I've kind of moved in a slightly different direction, you know, with things, I just wanted to make sure I came here and had a chance to say very publicly that you are easily the most influential and impactful colleague / academic / anything. And so thanks for that. I appreciate it.
Sergey. Sergey.
Well, I'm a relatively recent colleague of Steven here. Hired me at Carnegie Mellon in 2008, and actually I met him for the first time, I think, 2 years before that at Michael Ward's conference that Rajshri organized. And instantaneously, I think I realized that this kind of research and this kind of intellectual atmosphere is what I actually made my transition from Japan to the US for. And I've really been blessed by being around you for 5 years at Carnegie Mellon and having my office, the old Peter Thompson office, just opposite to you. I'm trying to emulate you, as Peter just said. It's very hard to emulate you in all respects. So David Hounshaw reminded me of my botched attempt to emulate Steven's work with undergraduate students. So when I was 2 years ago, for the first time, started teaching a big undergraduate class, I decided to do the same thing. So I invited those students who failed my first of the 3 midterms to come and talk to me. And the first woman who came in, when I asked her why, well, what happened, she broke in tears. And I somehow got through that experience, but I've never tried to repeat it. I don't know, how do you handle women's tears? I still don't know what to do about it. But anyway, Steven, thank you so much for you know, giving me this wonderful chance to. I've learned an enormous amount from him. And one thing that you may also not know about Steven is, although this has been mentioned already, he really surprised me. Whenever I have a new paper that I write, he reads it. Well, maybe you'd say it's normal for a senior colleague and mentor. He writes a lot of comments on the margins, and he even corrects my wrong English, which is all. I mean, okay, well that's great. But then I revise it and say I'll read it again, and then he gives me back the second version, the same number of comments, the same number of English corrections, and this keeps going on and on and on. And is enormously generous with his time and enormously supportive of, you know, people like me who are trying to make transition to this world of academic excellence, to which I'm still not sure if I belong or not, but if I ever belong to it, that would be That would be thanks to you, Steven.
Hi, Steve. I also wanted to share with you a letter from your colleague, Mark Camlett, who is the provost of Carnegie Mellon University. Hello all. I am more than a little proud to add my voice in recognizing Steven and the other founders and sustainers of the CCC, a project I have admired for many years, if alas, from afar. I think David Mowry's reflections hit the nail on the head that the unique focus of the conference on mentoring PhD students has perhaps been a source of greater synergy among established faculty than any traditional conference could have been, and has ended up playing such an important role in creating, defining, and perpetuating such an extraordinary field. If my memory is correct, I think my introduction to this effort occurred when I was Steven's department head, and I learned that one of the inaugural meetings was going to take place in Pittsburgh. My job was relatively simple. Make sure the weather is okay. I'm afraid I did a very poor job. I do not remember a colder, more miserable 2 days of weather in the last 25 years. Dan Leventhal drew an analogy to Shackleton, but I think Shackleton had it relatively easy by comparison. Nonetheless, and pleasingly though, the conference, like the field, has survived and prospered. Many congratulations to Steven, the other heavy lifters over the years, and to everyone at attendance at this year's event. I hope it goes great. Best, Mark.
And clearly one person who wanted to summarize Steve for you is Ashish Arora.
Hi, we're here to celebrate 20 years of CCC and to felicitate Steve Klepper. Time is short, so I thought I'd quickly jump into it. I was trying to think of what I have learned from Steve's body of work. It surely isn't pedagogy, because Steve hasn't updated his teaching methods in about a quarter of a century. He teaches from a textbook that's so old that it's no longer in print. Indeed, the author has no interest in keeping it in print, but except for Steve, I think, is the only guy who teaches from it. It isn't the discredited doctrines of cost spreading and similar such doctrines that nobody really believes in anymore. It surely isn't his attempts to generalize about capitalist dynamics from thinking about or from learning about obscure industries such as the automobiles and tires that nobody really cares about or has heard of. And so I've tried hard to think about what nice things I could say about having what we have learned from Steve. And I did actually co-author a book chapter with Steve. And truth be told, I didn't learn very much, but after having racked my brains, I remembered I did learn a great deal from Steve about punctuation and editing. And if you ever want to learn about how to mark off the subordinate clauses in a sentence using commas, Steve's your man. And so, I'm happy to be able to end on this positive note about what I've learned from Steve and his work. Seriously, though, it's been fantastic being a colleague of Steve's for 17 years and being a student of his work for even longer. Thanks. Bye.
So good evening. So I'm not a CCC alum, nor am I a long-standing faculty employee attending. So you may wonder, what am I doing out here? Well, my connection to Steven is through Michael Gord because of that very first paper that you and Michael wrote together in 1982 Economic Journal. Michael was my advisor and thus the genealogical tree. However, I'm not sure what that makes me of Steven. Stepchild, maybe? Let me explain and then also elaborate how I connect to CCC, which incidentally, of course, we've been told, as I was wrong, is on the Consortium for Competitiveness and Cooperation.
Nice one.
And I'll talk a little bit about what competitiveness and cooperation means to me in my career and my interactions with Steve. So when I first started on my dissertation data gathering to extend on the Gordon-Klepper data, Michael told me, you know, I've heard that Steve is also doing the same data gathering. Doesn't make sense for us to compete. Well, why don't you get in touch with him and maybe we can collaborate. Now, this is before 1990 or right around then. No email. So I send a very laboriously written letter to Steve, making sure that all of my grammar is correct, by the way. No answer. So about a month or two later, I write again to him. No answer. So I go about my own way, collecting the data, and then about 2 years later, I'm at the American Economic Association meetings, and Steve is presenting a paper based on his data collection efforts, and I go ahead and I introduce myself to him. And Steve and I talked about this earlier. I still recall very vividly his comment to me. He says, well, I got your letter, Ashri, but I didn't know how to respond, given that we're competitors after all. Now, what I hadn't known then, that Steve and Michael did have a history and some bad blood there as well, and that was being transferred over to me, hence the stepchild connotation out there. So we continued our own separate ways, and indeed, but one of the things that I found out is that more than Michael, I was following in Stephen's footsteps. Everything that I seemed to be interested in, Steve was there just 2 steps ahead of me, right? So this competition was really getting to me, Stephen. So it was in about 2001 that David Aldrich had actually invited both Stephen and me to the same conference. And that one of those evenings is where I felt that Stephen and I really connected. So I think one thing that Steve could do is finally tell me, whom I was close to Michael, just how horrible Michael had been to him. And I was able to listen to Stephen and understand as well as to what was going on. And so, you know, that was also when I found out that, in fact, Steve had not competed with me. He had actually collaborated in ways that I didn't know, in that he had been a reviewer on many of my papers. And I had benefited immensely, though I don't see it now, then, with all of the critical comments that I had received. So thank you, Stephen, on that. But I think there was one other competitive relationship that we established at that time. Stephen and I were going together trying to catch this flight that I was getting late for. And of course, I was lugging this huge suitcase, the biggest that you can carry on an international flight, and a computer bag to boot. And Steve has this light shoulder bag. Then as both of us are running, and of course I'm wearing 3-inch heels to boot, Steve is looking at me, and in fact, as we get to the final end, we barely make it to the flight, he chastises me in the way only Steve can do. You really need to travel light, right? And so every other conference in that collaborative relationship that began after that, Steve would come to me and say, let me look at your suitcase. Let me find out how you're traveling. And then he would brag about the fact that this little bag in which he can pack 4 days of clothes and still put it on there. And you know, my female vanity, there was just no way I was going to win against this competition. So I gave up a very, very long time ago. But seriously speaking, I'm really grateful to Stephen and the CCC community. As I look around this room, I see my collaborators, I see close friends, I see my students, and I see my students' students. And indeed, this is a community that has meant a lot to me. I find that Andy was telling me that I'm one of the top citers of Stephen's work, and of course I've benefited enormously from his trailblazing. And I'm deeply honored and indeed very touched, Stephen, that I feel like I am now your adopted child in this genealogical tree. And I really appreciate the fact that you asked me to help in the CCC community. So thank you very much. So, one thing though, just before we have Steve take over, sorry to do this, but it looks like we're going to have to transition into tomorrow's program today itself. And I'm going to take the unusual step of introducing this person now. I'm pleased to introduce Steven Klepper from Cornell University. He is going to speak about the origins of great firms. I'm hoping that in the sharp tradition of CCC, we can help him sharpen his ideas. So please welcome Steven Klepper, Cornell.
Thank you, Rajshri. It's good to finally have a chance to talk here. I feel like I've been waiting so long that it's been coming from an alternative universe or an alternative reality. By the way, the T in my name is silent, and the umlaut makes it more of a soft E, so it's closer to Klepper than to Klepper. The name comes from Middle High German, Klapper, or Kleppern, which is to chatter or talk endlessly about a topic. Among the Ashkenazi, it's someone who, it's an occupational name, someone who summons people to the synagogue by rattling a stick. It comes from the ancient Yiddish kleppen. Kleppen is to stick. In modern usage, it's understood to be someone who sticks to a research topic, particularly if that topic is obscure. Like the actual origin, county of origin of the pneumatic tire industry in the United States. By the way, that's almost certainly Akron, Ohio.
So, Mr. Klepper, you only have a few minutes. You might want to get on to telling us about your research.
Yes, thank you, Rajshri. This is still work in progress, and I'm very interested in hearing your comments during the time. Where do great firms come from in tremendous industry clusters, as exemplified today by Silicon Valley or Akron, Ohio? This is a question of utmost importance, both for the United States and globally. How do you grow these great modern firms? Silicon Valley is perhaps the most important engine of economic growth, not just in modern times, but ever. Yet this tiny region, which began as a cow pasture, covers less than 1% of the landmass of California, let alone the United States. Accounts for over 20% of all venture capital investments, 30% of all newly issued companies on the stock market. Akron, Ohio is just a small part of Ohio, a region known principally for cows and bad weather, and yet Akron is responsible for 80% of the tires ever produced. So how could these regions grow so enormously? What is the fertilizer that allows them to grow? First, from a single shoot, like the great tire producer B.F. Goodrich, and then to a whole grove of great trees. I've been working on this question for many years, and I now believe that only one thing links the great clusters that have developed over time. Silicon Valley, Detroit, Akron, Ohio. That link is cows. Before they began to grow, each area was a fertile cow pasture. Silicon Valley was literally Cow Valley. Akron, which in Latin means peak, is named that because it is one of the few places in the county where it is possible to see over the accumulated cow pies to the setting western sun. In both cities, founding firms had enormous access to abundant cow pies from which to make quality fertilizer. This meant that entrepreneurs could have truly outstanding corporate lawns that spoke to top recruits and to new talent, corporate lawns that said, the grass really is greener here. Once the first great lawn has been developed through careful tending, how does a cluster form? The story of Silicon Valley is again instructive. Its founders, the treacherous 8, left Shockley Laboratories because Shockley was simply unable to handle an invasion of pesky crabgrass. Fairchild Camera, in contrast, had developed a special trowel for removing weeds. Moving to Fairchild, these 8 future captains of industry learned the value of proper rolling, close mowing, and above all, careful edging. These founding 8 eventually left and formed so many spinouts they've been dubbed, very cleverly, the Fair Children. Intel, AMD, National. Even today, each one has an absolutely fabulous corporate lawn. Lawns based on skills they gained at Shockley and Fairchild and ready access to manure. Many people think the story of Silicon Valley is sui generis, that is particular and idiosyncratic to the qualities of the semiconductor industry. In fact, Silicon Valley is age-old. It's actually Zoysia-grass generis. Other clusters of related processes. Detroit is fescue generis, plus ready access to cow pies. The biotech hub of Cambridge, Massachusetts is ryegrass generis, plus access to organic free-range cow pies. My goal is to found such a cluster for the study of spinouts, clusters, industry shakeout, industry evolution.
Mr. Klepper, is this really feasible?
Is it reasonable that I could become like one of these founding firms and create my own cluster of thought? Both Ransom E. Olds and Henry Ford were long talkers like myself. In fact, Ransom E. Olds invented auto racing at the advice of his wife, who was hoping it would move him more quickly out of hearing range. Henry Ford invented the auto assembly line when all of his workers pressed themselves up against the wall farthest from his office. I believe I'm at least as long-winded as they are. In fact, the only longer talker I've found in my research is Frederick Patterson, who developed the grid pattern for white-walled tires and founded the great tire grid designing cluster in Canton, Ohio, a neighboring city to Akron, Ohio. Incidentally, you should see the cow pies in Canton.
You say that industrial evolution is based on learning and heredity from a primary firm like Fairchild. What about Jim Utterback's work in the role of dominant design?
Thank you, Mary. That brings us up to the issue of competing clusters like MIT and CMU. The idea of competing clusters dates back to the Peloponnesian War. It turns out the Spartans produced regular wheels while the Athens produced radial wheels. It is commonly understood that the Athenians lost the war. But if you look at the great radial wheel producing houses of Athens, you discover that they had a lower hazard rate of failure for the entire 5th century BC, and they were not replaced as the dominant producers of wheels until the Akron, Ohio cluster developed, powered by more powerful New World cow pies rather than Old World goat pies.
Professor Klepper, have you given any thought to how you might influence scholarship in general, not just cows?
Benjamin Franklin Goodrich, founder of the B.F. Goodrich Tire Company, was a surgeon during the Civil War. Before he developed his tire company in Akron, Ohio, he developed a school in the neighboring township of Cuyahoga Falls. The first thing he did was put down a very solid bed of topsoil. Then he put down the finest manure he could find, and then spent all the rest of his money on a fine seeding of Poa pratensis, appropriate for the growing region. In the spring, he had an absolutely amazing lawn, and students flocked to his school, the Competitive Cultivation Conservatory, or CCC. I intend to do something similar. My hope is that I will be able to influence an entire generation of people and show them the real importance of proper balance and posture when weeding dandelions or edging around difficult shapes like sidewalks.
Mr. Klepper, based on your passion and conviction, I am sure you will succeed. Indeed, I imagine many of the people in this room have been influenced by the talk that you gave here tonight, or one they were lucky enough to hear in the past. How many people in this room? Let's all stand. Steven, can I invite you up here to give a few thoughts and comments?
Yes.
Would you like to stand on
No,
that?
no, I don't think I need to stand.
Just to make Andy taller. Taller.
Well, I must say I'm a little overwhelmed, to say the least. I never thought anybody was going to discover my secret about geographic clustering. The rest of the program was fine, but now I'm really upset. I did want to say just a small number of things. I'm just tremendously touched by this entire day. It's really been extraordinary for me. And most of all, I really want to thank Rajri for this. What she said is completely true. I did have a difficult time and a difficult relationship with our common thread. And that really did stop me from responding in a more friendly manner at first. But I did return that friendship early on in an invisible way, in an anonymous way, by being a demanding referee, but a positive referee and a supportive one. So I admired you from afar, and since I've gotten to know you, I've admired you close up, except when I had to help carry your luggage. You have great energy and spirit, and I really feel incredibly comfortable about turning over the reins of the CCC to you for the future, and I'm eternally grateful for today. I have already thanked Bob Strom. I really want to thank him again for taking over and really providing a firm financial support for the CCC. And really, he's someone who I've interacted with intellectually, and I think it's great to see the slide today where we see that the biggest gain in type of research that's been done at the CCC is in the area of entrepreneurship, which really makes the support from the Kauffman Foundation that much more appropriate. So thank you very much, Bob. I finally had to stop begging all those people, many of whom are here today, like Mary, who I begged incessantly, Will Mitchell, who I begged incessantly, and many others, countless others who I can't really even mention at this point, many of whom gave from their own research accounts. I want to, of course, thank all the session leaders and all the people who just participated in this evening's, but especially Andy King, who, as I said, just completely stole my thunder. I really was intending on finally publishing that theory. Particularly as this goes way back. Actually, I think it goes further back, the clustering, than you even imagined. So thank you very much. These tributes were really extraordinary. And most of all, I want to thank my wife, Florence Rousier, of 33 years, who accompanied me today. And it's been a difficult time for me in the last year or two. And so she's just continually supported me at every stage, including being here with me today and bringing me here today. So I'll say more about that just a little bit later. But anyway, thank you, my dear. I do want to say a few words about the very origin of the CCC. The actual impetus for this was there was a second of two major grants that were awarded to this consortium. And it was a combination. It was particularly led back then by David Teese and Dick Nelson. And the consortium involved mainly at the time, from what I recollect, Columbia, where Dick was, and Berkeley, where David Teese was, Harvard Business School, Sloan School, Wharton, and I'm missing one other school. I think I wrote this down at one point. In any event, those were the main schools that were part of the CCC consortium. Dick invited about 10 or 15 of us, actually it was to Stanford where we had this lunch and whole day, and asked us, how did we think we could help generate a bigger community studying from a very serious standpoint, empirically really digging into the study of innovation, technological change, and organizations. The Sloan Foundation, which was created in many ways by Alfred Sloan to study these topics, was in many respects frustrated by not being able to get economists to talk seriously with real scholars, empirical scholars about innovation, about how to move this forward. And Dick said, we have a lot of money, and a big part of this grant is to foster this community. How would we go about doing that? And I thought about this and talked it over that evening. This meeting lasted a day, and talked it over with Dave Mowry and said, I don't I'm confident we can't change the intellectual agenda of already established faculty members. Indeed, I didn't really think we could change the intellectual agenda even of ongoing graduate students, but I thought maybe what we could do was improve the quality of the work of the small number of graduate students that were doing the kind of work that the Sloan Foundation was interested in supporting. And I suggested that the way we could conceivably do it, this meeting I think did take place in 1992, probably 1993, was that there were so few graduate students, there were only one or two at most at each institution, and only a few professors at each institution that were working in this area. It's hard to imagine now, but there's probably collectively maybe 20 faculty members who were seriously doing this kind of work back then. And I suggested that maybe if we brought together all the graduate students we could round up who we thought were in this domain, and we also would ask faculty members to come and pay their own way, that we could have sessions in which the graduate students bravely presented about 10 minutes on their work, what they were intending to do over the course of the next year and a half. And then we could chime in and begin to make many, many suggestions about how they might best proceed. And possibly out of this might grow a lot more collaborative advising, where the students could reach out to professors at other universities to be able to supplement the guidance that they could get at their own university. And so that's what hatched the idea. Dick Nelson said, okay, if you can raise half the money and you'll put it on at Carnegie Mellon, then we'll pay the other half from the Sloan Foundation. And that's what we did. And needless to say, this was forged in an incredible weather experience. No, David, I think I disagree with you. I bought the weather, the weather data 10 years later, because I wanted to show just how unusual this one particular weekend was. Because forever, all the people who attended this believed that the typical winter in Pittsburgh, it was 20 degrees below Fahrenheit from time to time. And in 32 years, now I think I can update it, the closest day I think we ever had was -2 in 32 years. But this particular weekend, the whole weekend was -20, I think it was even colder than -20 degrees Fahrenheit. It was so cold that I had reserved a hotel 3 blocks from the conference venue, and literally it was dangerous to walk from the hotel to the conference venue. We really had to make sure everybody was safe. But it was, it was quite an environment, and the excitement was really palpable. I'll never forget, I asked Sid Winter if he would sum up at the end of the conference his impressions. And I'll tell you what I recollect most from what Sid said. He gave a talk that I called the two heads talk. Sid always said that when he would go to conferences, he always needed two heads. The head that he normally had, that he would use to just discuss things with people, and then when he would go to, particularly an economics conference, he would take off his ordinary head and he'd have to put on his economics head. And that was a completely different head from the head that he normally used. And that had always been his experience, but this was the first time in his entire intellectual career that he only had to have one head. And I'll never forget that. The image of somebody taking off his head and replacing it with another one left a very profound idea in my mind, not a very comfortable one. So it was quite a statement that Sid had to make about the conference. And then from there, I mean, I don't think any of us before this happened could ever have envisioned that we would have done this a second time. It was really just a grand experiment. And needless to say, after that, Dave Mowry and Dick Nelson were very fundamentally involved. That's how the CCC really expanded internationally. And then sort of I came back and then started taking the whole thing over after they ran out of money and needed somebody else to keep this going. And that's the way it's been pretty much for the last 15 years, except now for the last 7 or 8, I think we're on much firmer footing. So I can't tell you how many hosts also, some of whom are here, who organize this locally, managed to keep everything going. So I wanted to say a few more things. I really have very little time. I have to leave on a plane. My provost chartered a plane for me to come down with my wife and my colleague Lee Brandstetter, which was really exceptional. I was afraid I was going to actually miss this year, somewhat for my own health reasons. So in some sense, the crew that flew us down here has to be back at an appointed time. They're not allowed to be away for too long, which is why I'm limited in the remarks that I'm going to make. So in many respects, like Cinderella, I have to be back at midnight. And that's really going to limit the last few things that I say. I've always had aspirations that the CCC community would become a challenger to sort of mainstream neoclassical economics. That, in the study of particularly market structure, competitiveness, innovation, and technological change. In many respects, I suppose that's an aspiration rather than something that's very realistic. The community is really not much more than 20 years old, and what I'm expecting is somehow it's going to challenge an intellectual community that's over 100 years old. But I still feel that that's the hope I have for the CCC. I had a lot of specific remarks about what intellectual areas I thought might actually work to enable the CCC community to challenge mainstream economics, but I really am running out of time, and I really do have to leave. I think I'm almost already overstayed the cruise welcome. So I won't go into those remarks. I just want to leave you by saying this was an extraordinary day for me. It's much, much more than I would have ever expected. You may not see me again. I hope that's wrong. I hope I'll be able to pull a rabbit out of the hat at the last moment, but probably not. And but unlike Cinderella, now I get to go home with my princess. Thank you all very much.